everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
One of the most interesting questions is, how are these fish that evolved to live on a coral reef, which by definition has to be shallow, how are they going to adapt when those waters get really warm and the corals bleach and die, and that's no longer, let's say, their preferred habitat? Will they go deeper? Will they migrate? These are all questions that a lot of biologists are working on. And in the continental sense, we have seen shifts. Some fish that we know occupied, let's say, northern North Carolina, are now showing up in New York because they're running away basically from the warmer water, looking for the best habitat. And that's because their prey is also migrating. And all these things are responding slowly but surely. In a continental sense, we're seeing it. On the islands, it's a little bit different because an adult fish cannot jump from one island to the other if it's really deep water between. So our hypothesis is that they're going to go deeper because there's colder water deeper. But that only has a limited time if we continue with the sea surface warming like it is. So we're trying to use sound to locate and then be able to better estimate what are the habitats that they need to conduct their reproduction so that we don't lose those species.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Michelle Schärer-Umpierre, a marine biologist. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Scott. Great to be here.
All right. As a marine biologist, you specialize in bioacoustics, which is a subfield of hydroacoustics that studies the propagation of sound in water. And then, of course, the interaction of the mechanical waves that constitute sound with the water, its content and boundaries. Talk to us about, specific to plants and animals, how it's being used to help explore the marine environment.
All right. So the history of acoustics and exploration in the ocean actually started with the Navy. They were listening to the ocean, trying to detect enemy submarines, but they kept on hearing things they didn't know what they were. So they actually hired biologists to catalog all the sounds that are made by the natural environment or by the organisms in the ocean. That led to one of the first catalogs of fish sounds by Fish and Mowbray, which is now housed at the Cornell University. So they actually wanted to see which animal it was from. So they would actually collect the animals, put them in tanks, and harass them a little bit to get their sounds. What I do is a little bit different because I'm actually listening to them in their environment, under their normal behavior, with all the other sounds that coincide, actually sometimes very cacophony-like. And we're trying to describe behaviors that are associated with sound to try to understand better what the fish are doing, how they're interacting either with their own species or with other species, and where and when they're concentrated when they aggregate to spawn.
Well, thank you for that overview. And I think it's important for the audience that are not familiar, because they're thinking, well, why not use light and different types of measurements around that? And of course, the light is very limited once you get beyond kind of tens of meters, and acoustic plays a bigger role. And to your point, it's interesting because sound is pretty abundant, right? I mean, not just marine animals, but even plants have sound. And through sonar technology, help us understand, because you mentioned behavior, but it can be used for everything from biomass estimation, from quantifying the fish to the type of organisms, and to your point, some of the environment-led types of group behavioral aspects.
Absolutely. Most of the work done with acoustics is what is classified as active acoustics. So that's when humans use sonar or different type of power towards the seafloor and then study the sound that comes back from that emission of sound. So as sound hits air, like in the bladder of a fish, it bounces differently as if it just bounced off the seafloor. So active acoustics is used for quantifying fish, actually seeing how high in the water column they are, and for fishing. That's how they find these really big tunas in the water column. But passive acoustics, which is what I specialize in, is actually just putting a hydrophone and leaving it there for 6 months and then picking it back up and seeing what we heard. But in order to do that with more confidence, we add optical equipment. So like you said, the light doesn't go very deep. And sometimes when it's turbid because of river flows or swells, or sometimes algae blooms, we can't really see very far, but the sound will travel. So we try to match the sound to the fish so that we know what's going on. And then we extrapolate from that what we hear.
Now, of course, one of the things with passive acoustics that you're referring to is that you have to be able to isolate the noise. And people outside of your field probably don't understand, but the ocean soundscape is pretty crazy. Like you say, it's somewhat of a cacophony. And when you take into account all the human activities around the ocean, from transport to yachting and whatnot, it does add quite a bit. So talk to us about, from a passive perspective, how do you start to isolate out those factors that are not the things that you're looking for, and then look for the deviations from the norm?
Right. So in the underwater soundscape, which is what we record, there's all kinds of sound. There's human sounds, like you say. There's actually geologically based sounds or wind sounds. There's wave sounds. And then there's the fish and the shrimp and the lobster and all these things. We can't really isolate. What we can actually do is highlight some of the frequency bands. So some of those layers where our sound of interest is. So the smaller the fish or the organism, the higher the frequency. It's just like drums. If you have a really big drum, the sound is really low. But if you have a really small one, it's higher. So we can sort of look to the area where those fish are making the sound to locate their calls. But we have a lot of sounds of other fish that we don't know who they are made by, because we really need to bump up our observations underwater, and our time is very limited down there. So when we're diving, which is the normal way of doing fish counts, the exhalation of our air doesn't let us hear. So we have to leave equipment that can see the fish doing their normal behavior and record the sound synchronously.
Understood. And of course, when you take into account, let's say, migration path and seasons and climate in the sense of nature, how do you look for things that is distinctively maybe curious from a research perspective?
Right. So our research question is actually based around understanding the behaviors that fish have that use sound. So a lot of their communication is actually visual on coral reef fishes, which is what we're studying here. And their displays sometimes are accompanied by sound. So those are the ones that we're focusing in to try to understand better what is going on when we keep on hearing this stereotypical sound over and over and over again. And then how does that increase or decrease depending on what's going on between the fish and their environment? And usually those sounds are associated with either feeding, foraging, alarm, or reproduction. So some of the fish need to get together and communicate with each other to organize their spawning aggregations, which is when they're going to reproduce. And that's where we're keying in to see when is that happening, at what time of the day, what time of the year, but also in what locations, if they're going shallower, if they're going deeper. All these things we can do remotely now with sound.
Fascinating. And I'm sure the audience is probably scratching their head thinking, help us understand, how does this relate to coral reefs? Although, for some of us, it kind of is, it seems fairly logical, but at the same time, how does climate change not only affect coral reefs, but also the behavior of the marine life?
Yeah, that's actually one of the most interesting questions is, How are these fish that evolved to live on a coral reef, which by definition has to be shallow, how are they going to adapt when those waters get really warm and the corals bleach and die, and that's no longer, let's say, their preferred habitat? Will they go deeper? Will they migrate? These are all questions that a lot of biologists are working on. And in the continental sense, we have seen shifts. Some fish that we know occupied, let's say, northern North Carolina, are now showing up in New York because they're running away basically from the warmer water, looking for the best habitat. And that's because their prey is also migrating. And all these things are responding slowly but surely. In a continental sense, we're seeing it. On the islands, it's a little bit different because an adult fish cannot jump from one island to the other if it's really deep water between. So our hypothesis is that they're going to go deeper because there's colder water deeper. But that only has a limited time if we continue with the sea surface warming like it is. So we're trying to use sound to locate and then be able to better estimate what are the habitats that they need to conduct their reproduction so that we don't lose those species.
Now, for the mainstream public, they're not as familiar with your work on a day-to-day basis, but I believe some of us, through the more recent PBS episode of Nature entitled Treasure of the Caribbean, which was produced by HHMI Tanglebank Studios, that showcase Cayman Crown. I wonder if you could tell us about that and the significance of the Cayman Crown and that particular, let's call it, lesser known coral reef.
Yeah, the advantage of finding a treasure like the Cayman Crown is that it is positioned in a special place that gives it a slight advantage to deal with climate change. So not a lot is known about, how all the corals are responding to the warming of the waters. But at the Cayman Crown, we've been able to see a special diversity and a special condition where it seems that they are being more resistant to the warming that we're seeing in the rest of the Caribbean. Part of it is their location and currents and less stress, perhaps from sunlight and UV radiation. So there's a lot of things there that we still don't know the mechanism, but what has been observed is that they bounce back better from the bleaching events, which are a signal of their response to warming waters.
So I think what you're talking about is the fact that it's very close to the edge of the Cayman Trench. And there, I guess, like you're saying, the currents are colder and it makes it much more habitable in terms of some of the nutrients that supports the reef life as well as the fish population. And those characteristics and some of the others that are yet to be fully determined or known is really helping for that area to be more resilient. But I guess my big question is, that's terrific for that particular area, but how do we take away some learnings from that and then apply it to other parts that's been devastated?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point to bring into the restoration conversation. So if we could figure out what are those species or what are those combinations of species of the more resilient coral reefs, then we can focus our protection measures and our restoration projects to those sites where it's more promising that they'll bounce back. Unfortunately, we can't control the water temperature. We can only pick where we want to invest most of our resources to recuperate some of the coral reefs as they adapt, because it'll take a longer time for them.
Mm-hmm. Now, my understanding is that the scientists and fishermen have been working together for some time, maybe almost a decade or so. And there's a number of work that's been happening, right? I wonder if you could talk about that, from mapping the reef to cataloging its inhabitants and a number of other things as well.
Yeah, it was a great collaboration that various researchers had already relationships with fishermen of the area who know it very well and had a concern about how that is going to respond to climate change and to other impacts such as overfishing, sedimentation, and they wanted to collaborate. So the data collection included mapping, identifying those species of coral, doing surveys of fish, and also putting down hydrophones to listen to the soundscape, which previously was unknown.
Amazing, amazing. And just to give it a little bit more color, if you could talk about the different types of fish that are unique to this area. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there's schools of yellow jack and blue tang and bottlenose dolphins and even the Nassau groupers. Anything that's kind of unique about some of them that you could talk about?
I think the fish assemblage that was documented there is very characteristic of lots of coral reefs in the Caribbean. I think the most impressive difference is the amount of fish. So there were some huge schools there that perhaps that combination of having the Cayman Trench, bringing up all these cooler waters with lots of nutrients makes it a hot spot for some of the species. But there are some cases of endemism in the Mesoamerican reef, which means there are fish there that don't occur anywhere else. And endemism in the marine environment is very rare because everything is well connected. The larvae can come and go pretty much everywhere. But there are some cases, and some very noisy cases, like the toadfish. Those animals are just honking day and night over and over, and actually making it very difficult to hear the other species that we were interested in hearing.
It sounds like some neighbors that we may have. Now, across the world, there's been a lot of initiatives and efforts, whether it's by NGOs or startups, that have been reviving bleached, dying reefs, and in some ways, actually bringing some of them back to life. What are some of the things that you're seeing that's working?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. We've learned a lot with the recent massive epidemic of this stony coral tissue loss disease, which affects certain species only. It just kills them really fast, but it doesn't kill everything. So it taught us a lesson of we really have to diversify our ability to spread different species of coral, not just the ones that are really easy to grow and grow really quickly. So that was something that we need to take into consideration and really identify those species that are going to be more resilient, because we know the water is going to keep on warming. So I think the way forward is looking at what is that combination that has shown us the most promise, and that's the one we should invest in. There are some projects that are just really covering areas like we saw in Belize of shallow elkhorn and staghorn corals, just massive growth of these corals. But that's only one zone of the reef, and the fish need all the different zones of the reef to complete their life cycle. So that's something that we need to look into. You know, it's more challenging, it's going to take more resources, but those other areas also will be needing restoration in the future.
Now, for somebody who has really dedicated one's life to this field, you have seen, I gotta believe, over the decades, and some of the prior work, even before the work that you're doing, the changes and how dramatic these changes are. And what is the call to action that you would tell our listeners?
Yeah, it's really sad to see some of these corals that you actually got to know disappear because they were thousands of years old and they're no longer there. For the corals' sake and for the sake of marine ecosystems, we have to bring that down, that CO2 production in the atmosphere. They don't really have another alternative. We can restore some things, but for them to be able to evolve like they have for millions of years, they need us to lower that rate of warming globally. So that will take the IPCC recommendations more seriously.
Perfect. Fantastic. Anything else that you can share around kind of the next areas of research that you're going to be undertaking?
Yeah, sure. Our interest is to see how some of these really important fish for local artisanal fisheries are adapting to the changes in warming water and currents and salinities and ocean acidification, which is another big one that we didn't even touch on. But how are these animals going to adapt their behavior, and can we hear that? So basically what we do is we try to see over the decades how the shifts are occurring in the seasons that these fishes are aggregating, so that as managers, we can adapt when they need to be protected to be able to spawn in peace. So for some fish that look for cooler water to spawn, it's predicted that their spawning aggregations are going to occur later in the season. And for summer spawners, which are a lot of the snappers, which are really popular, there's a prediction that they're going to shift earlier in their season. Unfortunately, we still don't know what snappers sound like, but for groupers, we can attack that question.
Well, thank you so much for your work and the listening that you're doing on our behalf. I've been joined by Dr. Michelle Schärer-Umpierre, a marine biologist.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.